I'm Looney Politics columnist Dale Smith, and Conservative MP Mike Dawson wants to refuse his raise. Now, he's tried challenging this at the Board of Internal Economy, and they said nope. That sets a really bad precedent for the rest of us, and they're right. So now he thinks he's going to go to court to try and sue to stop himself from getting a raise. Now, the court is going to laugh this out of court because of parliamentary privilege. Now, that means that Parliament, in a democracy like ours, gets to set their own rules and enforce them. The courts stay out of it and leave Parliament to run its own affairs, and that's proper because that's how a democracy should work. They set their own rules, they enforce their own rules, and if voters don't like that, then they can vote them out at the next election with another group who will then set hopefully better rules, if that is the issue. But the problem with Mike Dawson's particular complaint is that it's really toxic to democracy. Now, a lot of MPs like to say, and Dawson in particular is making this case that there's so many people struggling that it sets a really bad example if MPs take a raise right now. But the problem is that this kind of argument will always exist. There will always be people struggling, and if he wants to donate part of his salary, then good for him. I mean, he says he's already donating his raise, and that's not the point, but it is kind of the point because we pay MPs particularly well for a reason. And part of that is because it's a really demanding job. If you're doing it right, it's essentially a 24/7 job where every time you go out in public, you cannot have a bad day. You need to constantly be on when you're dealing with the public on a daily basis because you need to, always show that you're setting an example and that you always are listening to people's concerns and so on when they're complaining it to you in the grocery store line. And you do have to hear from some of the absolute worst people in the world complaining to you all of the time. And Parliament is a pretty tough place to be. There's a reason why it has a really high divorce rate for MPs. And, the salary does help to deal with that in certain respects. But, we also need to keep in mind that we pay MPs a high enough salary, not only to compensate for the time, not only because you have people in professions who lose money going into public office, but also because if it's not high enough, it encourages corruption because people then start taking kickbacks and so on because they can't make ends meet on meager salaries. And when you start going down these populist routes of constantly freezing or cutting MPs' salaries, there's no bottom to it. I mean, we can look at, for example, Texas, where they don't pay their state representatives a salary, and they only do sit a few weeks of the year, but that's really bad for democracy. There are always, other things like people, the NDP at one point tried to say, we should abolish the salary of senators and they can just be a volunteer position. But when you start doing that and when it starts filtering down to MPs, then what you wind up doing is making sure that the only people who get involved in public life are people who are already wealthy and who can afford to do so. And that's incredibly bad for democracy and representation, and Dawson should know better. And I'm hoping that the rest of his caucus will sit him down and tell him that he's making it worse for everyone else and that this is toxic to the way our parliament is supposed to work. For Looney Politics, I'm Dale Smith.